Lessons from Musashi, Beyond Technique and Rigid Thinking. Similarly, his admonition that you should not have a favorite weapon or any other exaggerated preference speaks to the dangers of rigid thinking and overspecialization, as relevant to modern corporate strategy as it was to 17th-century swordsmanship. Perhaps most profound is Musashi's concept of the void, a state of mind beyond technique where one acts without conscious thought, responding instantly and appropriately to changing circumstances. This idea closely parallels what modern psychologists call flow state, that condition of complete immersion in an activity where action and awareness merge and performance reaches optimal levels. This may have been Musashi's greatest advantage in his duel with Kojiro. While his opponent was highly skilled, Musashi had transcended technique, reaching a state where his responses were not calculated but intuitive, as natural and immediate as breathing. But returning to our original question, what really happened on Ganryujima that morning in 1612? And why does this duel continue to captivate us over 4 centuries later? The most honest answer to the first question is that the definitive truth is lost to history. The duel occurred in a time before photography, before standardized journalism, before the kind of detailed record-keeping we take for granted today. All we have are accounts written years or decades later, each filtered through the biases and agendas of their authors. What seems certain is that 2 exceptional swordsmen met in single combat, and only Musashi walked away. The rest, the wooden sword, the deliberate tardiness, the exact techniques used, may have happened exactly as described in the popular accounts, or they may have been embellished over time to better illustrate the principles Musashi himself would later articulate. As for why this duel continues to fascinate us, that's perhaps the more interesting question. For Japanese people, the duel represents a pivotal moment in their cultural history. It occurred at the transition between 2 eras, from the chaotic warring states period to the structured peace of the Tokugawa shogunate. In many ways, Kojiro and Musashi personify these 2 eras. Kojiro, the refined product of traditional martial arts schools, versus Musashi, the adaptable pragmatist who would thrive in changing times. For Americans and other Westerners, the duel offers a window into a culture both alien and fascinating. The concept of the samurai, warriors bound by strict codes of honor yet capable of extreme violence, has no exact parallel in Western tradition. Through stories like the duel at Ganryujima, we glimpse a world where spiritual depth and lethal skill were not seen as contradictory but complementary. But perhaps the most universal appeal lies in the duel's psychological dimensions. Strip away the cultural specifics, and you have a story about 2 different approaches to excellence: traditional mastery versus innovative disruption, technical perfection versus psychological warfare, rigid adherence to form versus pragmatic flexibility. These themes transcend both time and culture. Whether in business competition, athletic contests, or military conflicts, the tension between tradition and innovation, between technical excellence and psychological advantage, remains as relevant today as it was in 1612. Moreover, there's something compelling about the brevity and finality of the encounter. After years of preparation and anticipation, the duel itself lasted only moments. One decision, one action, one swing of a sword, and a life ended while another continued. This stark reality cuts through the abstractions we often hide behind and reminds us of the ultimate stakes in human conflict. To better understand the duel's significance, it helps to consider how it's been portrayed in Japanese culture over the centuries. The most famous fictional account appears in Eiji Yoshikawa's novel Musashi, serialized in Japanese newspapers from 1935 to 1939 and later translated into English. Yoshikawa's version particularly emphasizes the psychological aspects of the duel, portraying Musashi's tactics as the culmination of his development as both a warrior and a human being. In cinema, the duel has been depicted numerous times, perhaps most notably in Samurai Third, Duel at Ganryu Island, the final film in Hiroshi Inagaki's Samurai Trilogy, starring the legendary Toshiro Mifune as Musashi. Released in 1956, this interpretation reflects post-war Japanese values, portraying Musashi as a man seeking to transcend mere violence to find a deeper meaning in his martial skills. More recently, the duel has featured prominently in anime, manga, and video games, with each medium offering its own interpretation. The 1998 manga Vagabond by Takahiko Inoue presents one of the most psychologically complex versions of Musashi and his famous duel, while various video games have allowed players to reenact the encounter, sometimes with historical fidelity and sometimes with fantastical embellishments. Each retelling says as much about the era that produced it as about the historical event itself. During Japan's militaristic period before World War II, Musashi was portrayed as the ultimate warrior, dedicated to victory at any cost. In the post-war period, interpretations emphasized his spiritual growth and the moral dimensions of his approach. In contemporary works, his psychological complexity and inner conflicts receive greater attention. For American audiences, these multiple interpretations might be compared to how we've reimagined historical figures like Billy the Kid or Wyatt Earp through different lenses over time. Each generation finds in these historical figures what it needs or wants to see. But returning to the historical Musashi and Kojiro, what lessons can we draw from their encounter that remain relevant today? First is the power of psychological warfare. Before a single blow was struck, Musashi had already gained an advantage by disrupting Kojiro's mental state. In everything from sports to business negotiations, controlling the psychological environment often proves decisive. Second is the value of unconventional thinking. By rejecting standard approaches to dueling, arriving late using a wooden weapon, adopting an unusual fighting style, Musashi created situations his opponents weren't prepared for. Innovation often means willingly stepping outside established norms and accepting the criticism that comes with it. Third is the importance of comprehensive strategy. Musashi didn't just plan for the duel itself, but for everything leading up to it and immediately following. He considered factors others might ignore: the position of the sun, the timing of the tide, the expectations of his opponent, and integrated them into a complete approach. But perhaps most significant is what Musashi did after the duel. Rather than resting on his laurels or becoming trapped in the moment of his greatest triumph, he continued to evolve. He explored other arts, refined his philosophy, and ultimately created a legacy that transcended his identity as a duelist. This may be where Musashi most clearly surpassed Kojiro. While we remember Kojiro primarily for his role in this single encounter, Musashi is remembered for his complete life's work as a swordsman, artist, strategist, and philosopher. In his final years, as Musashi felt his death approaching, he retreated to a cave called Reigando to meditate and complete his writings. There, he composed his final work, Dokodo, The Path of Aloneness, a brief collection of 21 precepts that distilled his life philosophy. Among these precepts, accept everything just the way it is. Do not seek pleasure for its own sake. Do not, under any circumstances, depend on a partial feeling, and respect Buddha and the gods without counting on their help. These statements reveal a man who had moved far beyond the simple pursuit of martial victory. The warrior who once carved a sword from a boat oar to defeat a rival had become a philosopher concerned with the deepest questions of existence and meaning. Musashi died on May 19, 1645, at the age of 60, remarkably old for a man who had spent much of his life in mortal combat. According to legend, he died in the posture of meditation, his body remaining upright even after his spirit had departed. As for Kojiro, while his life was cut short in its prime, his legacy too has endured. His Tsubame Gaishi technique remains famous in martial arts circles, and his story serves as a reminder that even extraordinary skill has its limitations when faced with an opponent willing to change the parameters of engagement. In many ways, the duel between Musashi and Kojiro represents more than just a contest between two master swordsmen. It embodies the eternal struggle between tradition and innovation, between technical perfection and adaptable pragmatism, between following established paths and forging new ones. This may be why, over 4 centuries later, we continue to analyze, reenact, and reimagine their brief encounter on that small island. It's not just a story about two men with swords. It's a parable about different approaches to excellence and the ultimate test that reveals their relative merits. In modern America, we see similar dynamics play out across various fields. Think of how Steve Jobs challenged IBM's technological orthodoxy, how Muhammad Ali revolutionized boxing tactics against Sonny Liston, or how unconventional military strategies have proven decisive in contemporary conflicts. In each case, we see echoes of Musashi's approach: psychological disruption, unconventional methods, and comprehensive strategy that considers factors others ignore. But perhaps the most profound parallel is how these innovations are initially received. Just as many of Musashi's contemporaries considered his tactics dishonorable or unorthodox, true innovation is often first dismissed as improper or unfair before ultimately being recognized as genius. The story of Musashi and Kojiro reminds us that history doesn't always favor those who perfect existing systems. Sometimes it rewards those willing to reimagine the game entirely. So what is the shocking truth behind this legendary duel? Perhaps it's that the encounter itself, while dramatic, is less important than what it represents. The brief clash of steel on that island morning was merely the visible manifestation of a deeper contest between different philosophies and approaches to life itself. Musashi prevailed not just because he was the better swordsman in a conventional sense, but because he understood something that Kojiro, for all his technical brilliance, did not: that the greatest battles are won before they're fought, in the mind rather than with the sword. In his own words from the Book of Five Rings, "You win battles by knowing the enemy's timing and using a timing which the enemy does not expect." On that morning in 1612, as the sun rose over Ganryujima, Miyamoto Musashi didn't just defeat a rival swordsman. He demonstrated a principle that would ensure his legacy for centuries to come: that true mastery lies not in perfecting what is known, but in venturing beyond it into unexplored territory. And that, perhaps, is the most valuable lesson we can draw from this ancient duel. Whether in combat, commerce, or creativity, the greatest victories often come not from playing the existing game better than anyone else, but from changing the game in ways others haven't yet imagined. 400 years after Musashi and Kojiro faced each other on that small island, their brief encounter continues to inspire and instruct us, not just as a tale of martial prowess, but as a timeless parable about innovation, adaptation, and the courage to challenge conventional wisdom. In a world that increasingly values disruption and creative thinking, perhaps Musashi's greatest legacy is not his undefeated record or even his written works, but the mindset he exemplified, one that refuses to accept established limitations and constantly seeks new paths to excellence. As we face our own challenges in a rapidly changing world, we would do well to remember the warrior who carved a sword from a boat oar and changed the course of martial history with a single decisive stroke. Thank you for watching this exploration of one of history's most legendary duels. If you enjoyed learning about Miyamoto Musashi and Sasaki Kojiro, please consider subscribing to our channel and giving this video a thumbs up. Your support helps us continue to bring you more fascinating stories from Japanese history and culture. Until next time, remember Musashi's wisdom. There is more than one path to the top of the mountain.